Come to the marriage. The final atonement is the same as the marriage. The fact that this final intercessory work comes after the judgment for the individual teaches man the message of justification by faith. Since a work of intercession was still needed after the judgment, we can know that man still needed intercession during the judgment. Christ's character still needs to stand in place of man's character as a substitute at the judgment. Chapter 9, the blotting out of sin as presented by Matthew. The Greek controversy, page 426 and 428. The coming of Christ as our high priest to the most holy place for the cleansing of the sanctuary, brought to view in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. The coming of the Son of Man to the Ancient of Days, as presented in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. And the coming of the Lord to his temple, foretold by Malachi, are descriptions of the same event. And this is also represented by the coming of the bridegroom to the marriage, described by Christ in the parable of the 10 virgins of Matthew chapter 25. In the parable of Matthew chapter 22, the same figure of the marriage is introduced. The above statement gives several texts that are all description of the same event. This is a very helpful quotation because a person can recheck his conclusions from several sources. So step 1, the investigative judgment. Step 2, the blotting out of sin or final atonement. And this can be found in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, in Malachi chapter 3, in Matthew chapter 25, and in Matthew chapter 22. This is representing all description of the same event. It was concluded from Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, that there are 2 steps involved in the cleansing of the sanctuary for the individual, according to the Greek controversy, page 421 and 422. Step number 1 is the investigative judgment. Step number 2, the blotting out of sin or final atonement. It was also concluded that the blotting out of sin affected the character. It removed the inherited tendencies to sin from the character. This work was started at conversion and is finished at the final atonement. The parable of Matthew chapter 22 is a description of the same event as is described in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. Therefore, a study on the marriage should give the same conclusion. The Greek controversy, page 428. In the parable of Matthew chapter 22, the same figure of the marriage is introduced, and the investigative judgment is clearly represented as taking place before the marriage. Previous to the wedding, the king comes in to see the guest, so to see if all are attired in the wedding garment, the spotless robe of character, washed and made white in the blood of the Lamb. This work of examination of character, of determining who are prepared for the kingdom of God, is that of the investigative judgment, the closing work in the sanctuary above. The above statement makes it very clear that the investigative judgment takes place before the marriage. The 2 steps listed above are step number 1, the investigative judgment, step number 2, the marriage. This parable is a description of the cleansing of the sanctuary as listed in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. Now it is clear that step 1 is the same step in both passages. That event is the investigative judgment. If these 2 passages describe the same event, then step 2 should also be the same. The blotting out of sin or the final atonement is step 2 in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. The marriage is step 2 of Matthew chapter 22. Therefore, the marriage and the final atonement should be the same event. The word atonement means at one meant, according to Bible Commentary, Volume 6, page 1077. Paul tells us in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 31 and 32, that marriage is an at-one-ment. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. In a marriage, a man becomes one flesh with his wife. Paul is applying this concept to Christ and his people. Christ wants to unite with his church. That is a union of humanity with divinity. Christ Object Lesson, page 307. By the marriage is represented the union of humanity with divinity. Therefore, the marriage is an atonement. Step 2 is the same as Matthew chapter 22 and Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. Remember that both of these events, the final atonement and the marriage, take place after the case for an individual is investigated. That tells that a union of humanity with divinity takes place after the name comes up in judgment. The term final atonement suggests a final, finished, or completed work. That would be perfection. It was concluded from Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, that the blotting out of sin, which is the step number 2, was a blotting out of sin from the character. In other words, the blotting out of sin affected the character. Matthew chapter 22 is a description of the same event. Step 2 is the marriage, and it represents a union of humanity with divinity. That means the marriage affected the character. Just as the final atonement of blotting out of sin completes or finishes the work of grace for man, so the marriage completes or finishes the work of grace for man. Early writing, page 280. While Jesus had been ministering in the sanctuary, the judgment has been going on for the righteous dead and then for the righteous living. Christ had received his kingdom, having made the atonement for his people and blotted out their sins. The subjects of the kingdom were made up. The marriage of the Lamb was consummated. Consummated means to complete or finish. Therefore, the marriage or final atonement is the finishing of the union of humanity with divinity. That work is not completed until after the investigative judgment for the individual. The final atonement was the blotting out of the record of sin. Since the marriage is the same event, the marriage would happen when the record of sin is blotted out. That would be the work that needs to be done to perfect man or completely unite humanity to divinity. The blots of sin were selfish thought habit patterns. These habit patterns give us the tendencies to sin. When sins are blotted out, it will finish the work of removing the tendencies to sin. If the marriage is the same event as the blotting out of sin and the final atonement, then the marriage should accomplish the same work. The marriage is a union of humanity with divinity. Notice that the union of humanity with divinity removes the inherited tendencies to sin. Bible Commentary, Volume 7, page 943. We must realize that through belief in him, it is our privilege to be partakers of the divine nature and so escape the corruption that is in the world through lust. Then we are cleansed from all sin, all defects of character. We need not retain one sinful propensity. As we partake of the divine nature, hereditary and cultivated tendencies to wrong are cut away from the character. In the above, it states that as we, humanity, partake of the divine nature, hereditary and cultivated tendencies are cut away from the character. The marriage is a union of humanity with divinity. Therefore, we could say that the marriage cuts away hereditary and cultivated tendencies to sin. We need not retain one sinful propensity. This work was started at conversion, according to Bible Commentary, Volume 6, page 1101, but it is not finished until the final atonement. The blotting out of sin in Matthew, according to Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, step 1, 2, and the result. The investigative judgment for individual is followed by the blotting out of sin or the final atonement and the inherited tendencies blotted out. Matthew chapter 22, the investigative judgment for individual, the marriage is consummated, which are the same steps, 1 and 2. In the result, the inherited tendencies are cut away. All of these passages are a description of the same event. Come to the marriage. May the Lord bless you as you are answering his invitation.